The last year was a Taliban takeover, which was a tragedy for the country, a tragedy for democracies of the world, and a tragedy particularly for the educated, progressive class of Afghanistan. That was surprising for many of us who were following closely Afghanistan and all the political dynamics into it. We were predicting and a change, a system change, not a system change, a government change, but we were surprised by a complete takeover and a collapse of republic and replaced by a totalitarian system. That was surprising, and I think that marked as a tragedy for many Afghans who believe in the progressive society, democratic values, and an inclusive society.
It's really the fact that the authority of the Taliban has been so far maintained. When I look and watch it and think about it and follow it, it's clear that the Taliban leadership, as now constituted, and has been built up over the last year, it is very narrowly based. It is really still, in many ways, at the top level, quite isolated. It's much of it based in Kandahar. Its statements about policy decisions and so on are often not very clear, not very precise, and it does seem to be relying really very extensively on a sort of basic culture of obedience to the Shura. I mean, obviously, as we will discuss, things are much more complicated than that in many ways, but all the same, such a idiosyncratic form of leadership and government in such a challenged country and territory, it wouldn't have been surprising if really that authority had been very obviously undermined by now, given the fact that, of course, they weren't really expecting to win power in the way they did, and there was so much that was unexpected about the events of a year ago.
Over the last year, what surprised me the most is the indifference people have shown towards us. Not everyone. I mean, there are organizations and news channels and other people who've really tried to help us and have been keeping us afloat for the past year. But the majority of people seem to not care as much. And over the year, that has I've seen more and more people just telling me to, I guess, sort of come to peace with the Taliban, which I don't see how that's possible for me, since they've literally traumatized my people, killed millions of our people over the 20 years. How can I come to peace with a group of people who are extremists and have killed millions of children?
I will briefly state the things that were really surprising me. Number one, the opposite result of the Doha peace talks and the rise to power of a terrorist group in the country. And we have heard many times that the Taliban have changed, but unfortunately, there has been no change in the Taliban performance. Abandoning Afghanistan to a terrorist group by America and NATO, and the silence of the international community in front of all the crimes of the Taliban.
What's been surprising is that the war is evidently largely over. I mean, I know there's still challenges with security, and there's a resistance forming and bombings that have occurred. But in large part, this war is over. There used to be 100, 200 people dying a day from clashes, and that is no longer the case.
First is, of course, that Ayman al-Zawahiri, the emir of al-Qaeda, was found in a house in Kabul, not far from the presidential palace, the house that was controlled by the acting minister of interior of the Taliban regime. And all of this reflecting clearly a clear violation of the terms of the Doha Agreement, in which they pledged that they would not allow international extremists to have sanctuary in Afghanistan. That clearly has been violated, and our intelligence and counterterrorism forces very impressively brought him to justice some over a decade or so since he took over from Osama bin Laden. The second development is how slow the withdrawal of the Afghans who earned the right to a special immigrant visa for themselves and for their families has been from Afghanistan and from even Pakistan, to which many of them have fled.
What clearly emerges as one positive thing set against so many negative things, which we'll come on to. One positive thing is there's been a marked decline in armed clashes and in that form of violence. I mean, I will just look at a reminder of the statistics here. The report to the United Nations Security Council in June recorded an 80% decline, of course, in the previous 10 months in sort of formal, in armed clashes. And the International Crisis Group, I think in mid-July, put that figure of decline in the previous 10 or 11 months at minus 87%. So, I mean, this is really very striking indeed. And it's backed up by a lot of anecdotal evidence.
Well, I don't see any positive change since the Taliban takeover. They are saying that there has been a reduction in corruption, but then that is highlighted as one of the positive by many media reports. But again, there's no money, to be honest, in the country. So it's hard to identify that as a progress. But overall, from my lens, I haven't seen much of progress.
I believe the positive change, though there aren't many, but for me, one of the positive changes is the strength I've seen Afghan women show. 20 years ago, I believe this wasn't the case. People just agreed to the rule of the Taliban. But this time, I've seen people, especially women, rise up against them and who still fight to this day, who live in Afghanistan and still have the courage to stand up against the Taliban, even though they can very much easily kill them and no one would even know.
In my opinion, the positive are just two issues. One is that the women of this land stand up against this group without any support. And the formation of popular war fronts against this group is really accountable.
Well, being truly objective, the reduction of violence, particularly in the areas that were the most hard fought, that is very welcome, needless to say, to those in those areas. It has reduced very substantially the civilian losses that Afghanistan had experienced over the past 20 years, but especially in more recent years when the fighting has escalated. Unfortunately, the cost of that has been the establishment of a Taliban regime that has taken the country back to a 7th or 8th century interpretation of Islam and denies women any real opportunity in society or the economy, and girls cannot go to secondary school and young women cannot go to college.
A positive thing is that the war is over. And although there still is violence in the country, there are bombings, Shias have been targeted, ISIS is still active, and the head of Al-Qaeda was just killed in a US drone strike. So there are challenges, but the number of deaths from clashes have gone dramatically down. And this is reported by Emergency NGO, for example, which receives trauma patients and the like. Another thing is that the regional countries are more engaged in Afghanistan, something that happened as a result of the US pullout, but also as a result of US efforts to get regional countries involved.
The fall of Republican government, violation of women's rights and human rights, poverty and unemployment, labor force leaving the country, forced migration of national of the country, genocide of ethnic group, the dissolution of the country's security and defense forces, the spread of terrorism, a removal of women from the political and social
The most negative change is that Afghanistan is going hungry. People are starving. 90% of the population doesn't have enough to eat. There's been a rollback on women's rights. Repressive policies of the Taliban have resulted in, for example, girls not going to secondary schools for most of the country. And when the schools were opened up, of course, secondary public schools for girls were not. So these are two big challenges facing the country.
My starting point, of course, is in the situation which the new Taliban leadership and regime inherited. And if you may allow me, I was just going to remind everyone really of some sort of basic statistics, the sheer scale of the statistics that demonstrate some points that I'm keen to make. So World Bank statistics, a reminder, in the year 2000, life expectancy in Afghanistan was 56. By 2020, it had gone up to 65. In 2000, no females went to primary school. In 2020, 83% were recorded as going to primary school. Looking at the economy, the GDP per capita in 2002, per capita GDP $179, 2019 $509, so an increase of more than four times. The economy since 21, the report to the Security Council, the economy has declined by over 30%, and incomes have declined by over 20%, 82% of households in debt. And by the end of this year, poverty could climb, by some estimates, to 97% of the population. Now, that's just a reminder of the sort of basic point of how much actually was achieved in spite of all the comments and criticisms in the 20 years of the different regime, the different government after the US and NATO intervention in 2001. How much was achieved? I know that's particularly true in urban areas, but for a lot of people. And so when we look at the statistics and the stories and the anecdotes and so on now, we have to make those comparisons. And that, of course, is why, particularly for people who invested time and personal commitment and so on to Afghanistan, it can be such a depressing subject.
Well, the restrictions on the women and girls and detention of journalists and restrictions on freedom of speech from my side has been the most negative impact of the Taliban takeover in last year, especially ban on girls' secondary education was a disaster.
The collapse of the economy, the restriction of opportunities and rights for women and girls when it comes to activities in society and education and so forth. Just the generally oppressive regime concepts, the increase of activity by the Islamic State Khorasan group, that's the affiliate of the Islamic State operating in Afghanistan and Western Pakistan, and then probably the sheer challenge when it comes to all but maybe 10% of the population getting enough to eat on a daily basis. The malnourishment is very, very widespread and truly tragic.
The most negative changes, again, the indifference people have shown us and the way they treat us like, well, I guess we're not important to them anymore, since it doesn't make a difference in their lives. It's just our lives that's been ruined, so they don't really care much. And the fact that they want us to come to terms with the Taliban, which is absurd, to be honest.
Will the Taliban regime realize that they have undermined support from the rest of the world by the very repressive practices they have resumed, really, because this is really very similar to the way they acted when they had power in the late 1990s. Beyond that, will the extremist threat that is present there, without question, that represented by the Islamic State, which is fighting against the Taliban, and that which is represented by Al-Qaeda, which is more of an ally to the Taliban. Witness Zawahiri living just a few blocks from the presidential palace when he was brought to justice. Do these extremist elements begin to pose an international threat, similar to, say, the threat that was posed by the Islamic State when it established its caliphate in northern Iraq and northeastern Syria? Beyond that, what about the sheer humanitarian tragedy that is modern day Afghanistan, the starvation, the malnourishment, the lack of economic opportunity? The only growth industry in Afghanistan right now is the opium industry, and that now the arrival of methamphetamine production. And then does the United States finally begin to meet its moral obligation to the more than 160,000 Afghans and family members, those Afghans who qualify for a special immigrant visa, but have not been brought to the United States in accordance with the policy on that visa?
Well, there are many important issues to watch over the next few years. First is a Taliban close ties in their relationship with the other transnational terrorist groups and their finances, how they finance their regime if the money is not flowed from other sources. That's one area. And the second area is their attitude, policies, and behaviors toward the women, girls, and progressive and intellectuals of society. And the third is how they provide resources to the needy and to the most vulnerable segment of society.
When we're looking at both the Taliban's promises on human rights and the US's responsibilities to Afghanistan, and when we talk about hunger, we know that it's a complex crisis, but it's a humanitarian crisis with underlying economic issues. And part of those economic issues are driven by the crippling of the banking sector and the seizing of Afghanistan's foreign reserves. So the central bank doesn't function in the way that it should. There's a cash shortage, which may be getting better. But ultimately, this is a crisis. The humanitarian crisis is driven by the economic crisis. And what we want to look for are ways that the US and other countries are going to be able to help ease that crisis, and how discussions will go for releasing those central bank reserves back into the economy and getting banking going, which is a necessary part of the recovery for Afghanistan.
One is going to be really what happens with the leadership, what happens with this rather, well, we'll put it mildly, strange, with obvious limitations, leadership structure that I described at the beginning. By definition, I'm bound to feel that that looks vulnerable, even if it has survived really quite effectively for the first year. And then the second one really is the attitude of the international community and how the international community is going to respond to the situation we've been describing. Because of course, the basic and obvious, very clear initial response from the international community, or particularly the Western sort of the community, the liberal democratic community, has been sort of sanctions and cutting off cooperation and doing everything possible to ensure that Taliban leadership, Taliban resources, Taliban abuses and so on are in no way facilitated by international community, and particularly liberal democratic society support. And okay, well, that's fine, but there are so many perfectly rational arguments for saying, well, okay, but that's not helping the people of Afghanistan if that just carries on being the attitude of the wider international community, and it's certainly not necessarily helping all the vulnerable people in Afghanistan, both in terms of poverty, in terms of jobs, and of course, above all, in terms of the position of women.
In my opinion, the international community should take an action and prevent the spread of terrorism in Afghanistan in order to prevent this great threat to the region and the whole world. And then seek a legitimate and inclusive government consisting of people of all ethnic groups to ensure women's rights, human rights, and security. Also, sanction against countries that they support terrorism today.
To me, our new generation, I've seen them fight against everything that's been happening with a strength that I could never imagine anyone else having. I lived back home for 18 years of my life, and I saw our new generation working hard, facing challenges no one else would have dared to, and dreamed of building our country, rebuilding a country, and not only our country, the whole world. I saw them wanting to be astronauts, scientists, and whatnot. And for me, our next generation, I believe, is going to change not only our country, but hopefully the whole world.